Okay, so our discussion today is going to be on mergers and acquisitions. Now, I'm looking at there. I'm not sure. You find, sir, are you a Treasury practitioner or are you a banker or?
Myself?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. Perfect. So I'm looking around. Do we have any practitioners, Madame?
I'm working in the back office department at Desjardins.
At Desjardins. Okay. I'm just questioning what content now is actually applicable to the non-practitioners in the room. That's fine. You know what? The topic anyway today is going to be on mergers and acquisitions and specifically around the integration challenge that practitioners face as they work through the process of integrating newly acquired companies. As a Treasury advisor for TD Securities, working with global clients, I'm going to be talking about strategies around optimization and basically pre-M&A preparation. And then Amanda will be talking specifically around and drawing some valuable insights from her experience with the PetroCanada Suncor merger and breaking her dialogue into three distinct components. One will be pre-M&A period, basically closing day, and then post-M&A or current day, so that you can understand the evolution of what that process looks like from an integration standpoint. So let's kick this off.
So for those of you who are not familiar with Suncor Energy, Suncor is a Canadian oil and gas company. It was established back in 1917, began trading on the New York Stock Exchange in 1992, and it celebrated its billionth barrel of oil in 2006. Today, Suncor is Canada's premier integrated energy company, fifth largest North American energy company, and has a place on the global stage as one of the largest independent energy companies in the world. As Kyle briefly mentioned, I'm here today to share Suncor's Treasury integration journey. Suncor's Treasury team has been working on integration activities since the 2009 merger of PetroCanada and Suncor. From an expansion perspective, this deal was huge for Suncor. Suncor went from having operations in 2 countries, to over 10 countries. Our cash management banking relationships grew from 2 banks to over 30 banks. Treasury's journey to fully integrate and standardize all Treasury activities took over 5 years for us to complete. Throughout these 5 years, it actually really felt like forever at the time. But one thing I can say for sure is that the work that we did was well worth it. In March of this year, Suncor acquired Canadian Oil Sands. And as a result of the streamlining, standardizing, and automating of Treasury processes post-PetroCanada merger, Treasury was successful at fully integrating all COS Treasury activities into Suncor's existing structure within 8 business days of the close of the acquisition. We did invest a significant amount of time planning the COS integration activities, but as a result of the pre-acquisition due diligence work that was done, COS was fully integrated by April 1st. So now I'm going to hand the presentation back to Cal, who's going to provide a quick backdrop on M&A activity in North America over the past few years and what the motivation is for companies to participate in M&A activities.
Perfect. So let's look at the last couple of years. Specifically, 2015 was an historically record year for M&A activity. There was approximately $2.5 trillion just in North America alone. If you look on a global scale, that number for M&A activity goes into the hundreds of trillions of dollars. Yet, at the same time, despite those record levels, statistics continue to tell us that anywhere from 60 to 75% of M&A activity fail to achieve their desired synergies that they thought they were going to achieve. Right? I find those two numbers fairly counterproductive and kind of staggering when you think about it, when you think of the scope of the M&A activity. Now, if you look to a couple reference points, CFO Magazine states that the failure of much of the M&A activity with respect to what they have seen and feedback from CFOs is the underachievement of the integration process. And that's one of the, obviously, the key drivers for today that we're going to be talking about. And then if you look to Bain & Co., the Boston-based consulting company, they indicate that the primary driver for deal disappointment is a failure during the due diligence process, that it failed to highlight the critical issues that needed to be identified. Now, of course, from a Treasury perspective, as we will have all heard from this point, Treasury over the last 10 to 15 years has completely shifted with respect to its importance within a corporation. It's transitioned from more of a reactive back office cost center to much more proactive, strategically driven, consultative role within a corporation. And so specifically as it relates to those two issues around integration and identifying the risks and the opportunities, Treasury needs to involve itself early, needs to demand a seat at the table, and then needs to pursue the activities today that will position itself to achieve in the future as you look to either bolt-on acquisitions or something more transformative as it relates to a larger acquisition, such as the Suncor merger, for example. So let's jump forward onto that, just a bit of a backdrop. Again, some of the value levers here as corporations, just to reiterate some of the general background here, there are many reasons why a company would choose for mergers and acquisitions as a path for growth. Obviously, there's expansion, there's increase in market share, looking at the competitive enhancement and the rationalization process. There may be specific strategic assets that they're pursuing that they feel would give them a competitive advantage. But of course, the challenge of all that within all of those value levers for a treasurer, that represents potentially new geographies that they have to deal with, new currencies, new trade flows, new bank relationships, new counterparty exposures, new risks to evaluate, obviously new systemic issues they have to deal with. All of that is key to realizing the synergies that were inherently in what they would have referred to as the deal thesis around these are the key aspects that have to be successful in order for us to reach our synergies we desire to have. So at the same time, although you need to focus your time and energies as a treasurer on those efforts, you still need to make sure that things are running smoothly with day-to-day operational, whether there's funding adequacy, whether the risks are continuing to be mitigated. Of course, forecasting is important, and all the day-to-day things. And so there's a great importance for a treasurer to get involved early, understand how they can participate in generating the synergies, but how robust that role is today is completely different than the way it was 10 or 15 years ago. So it's of great importance, very relevant from a treasury practitioners today. So let's jump forward, and we'll do our first question.
Yeah, so we have a polling question here, but I think we can probably just do by a show of hands.
Yeah.
How many of you here attending the session today are actually anticipating M&A activity in the next 12 to 18 months? There we go, that's good.
Okay. Nearly half the group. We'll take that. We'll take that proportion. It's interesting, you know, from an integration standpoint, when I work with global clients, and whether they're working on smaller bolt-on acquisitions, as I said, or something more transformative, no matter where they are with respect to that acquisition, they can find themselves, from my perspective, along a continuum of, in essence, 5 key phases. And a lot of this is defined by the degree of centralization that they find themselves in from a treasury standpoint, moving anywhere from what historically has been a very decentralized or very fragmented, for number 1 down here, decentralized treasury where there's a great deal of autonomy and a fragmentation with respect to technology and file formats and ERP environments, and even the procedural documents. Everything is disparately done relative to the other affiliates within the body. And as you move up that continuum, there's a greater concentration of treasury responsibility into a single unit, be that on a regional or on a global scale. So you can find yourself as a treasurer anywhere along this continuum when an M&A takes place. And of course, how you deal and how you integrate the acquisition will depend on where you are. If you're very decentralized, your treatment of a bolt-on acquisition may just be allowing them to have full autonomy, because that's your mentality, that's your culture. If you have a bolt-on acquisition when you're fully globally optimized, they're going to adopt everything that you have in a very clear playbook of file formats and structure and procedural compliance and governance that they need to have. So it will be handled differently. And so it's interesting that the M&A opportunity forces you to stop and reflect where you are along this continuum, consciously or unconsciously, and reflect how you can best integrate that. Let's move that one forward. So before I talk about some of the key themes that global clients are facing, and as they look to M&A activity, for example, there's an importance around the idea of language. And language, coming from a French background, was always very interesting to me. It conveys intention, and it conveys the direction of any kind of a dialogue. If you're aligned with some other person with respect to language, then of course there's going to be a continuity in your understanding. There's going to be a common direction that you're moving forward. If there's a misalignment, then there could be confusion and a misunderstanding. So I always think back to a story that my friend had told me in high school. She was 15 at the time and was heading off to Paris to take on a position as a nanny for a family. And she got picked up by this lovely older couple who had, you know, an 8 and a 10-year-old at home, and she was going to take care of their kids for the rest of the summer. And they asked her, what was the first thing that you've noticed about Paris? What do you like about Paris? And she was thinking, how can I be complimentary? I've got to use the right words here. And she's working on her French. And so she noticed how big and beautiful the sides of the roads were, the verge of the roads. So she wanted to say, I'm going to tell them the verge of the roads are big. And it's really beautiful. So she said, les verges sont tellement grandes. And of course, in Paris, verge means a man's penis. So basically what she conveyed is that the penises were large, and Paris was the first thing she noticed. And therefore, there was a bit of a misalignment around language. But still, language in the corporate context, we all face internal versus external language. We face bank language. We have the IT groups have their own very specific language. You know, the target versus acquirer language, and trying to bring consistency to that is obviously very important. So if I can distill down all the feedback that I've had over the years of working with global clients around how they try and optimize their treasury prior to integrating other entities, or just optimization in general, it really comes down to 3 key themes and 3 key priorities in the dark blue. Definitely, and these will not be earth-shattering for anyone who's read literature from a treasury perspective. The movement from fragmented or a decentralized treasury to a centralized one obviously is very, very dominant theme, and that relates to, as indicates here, procedurally there's a movement towards centralization. There's an idea of bringing liquidity management together, account visibility and control from a central global or regional treasury standpoint. Risk management is being brought together, whether that's currency, interest rates, or otherwise. That's one of the dominant themes that I see virtually with every single client. The second theme and priority for global treasuries is how they look to simplify processes, blow up the legacy structures, and rethink around, is there a better way for us to do this? Can we standardize and consolidate? Now, of course, one of the greatest things that I've seen that facilitates progress for a treasury is the technological aspect. So when we talk about consolidation, we're talking about reducing the number of IT platforms, ERP environments, treasury workstation instances, et cetera, bringing that down to a few or a single one on a global level. Rationalizing, as we talked about, I'm not sure I can say CPA anymore. I think as of this morning they changed their name. Payments Canada. Payments Canada, with what they're advocating with respect to ISO XML as a global standard. I'm seeing just more and more clients adopting ISO 20022 XML version 3 as the desired file format, moving to bank-agnostic solutions around SwiftNet File Act, away from the bank-specific connectivity channels. Excuse me. And then lastly, obviously, one of the key things around automation and efficiency, doing more with less, ever since the liquidity crisis of 2008, of course, where treasury teams were downsized and they need to leverage technology to do more with less. Things like digitizing paper processes, how they can increase their hit rate with straight-through processing, you know, getting rid of processes that are non-core for them, whether that's remittance delivery or if that's check printing, et cetera. Outsourcing all that to banks or third parties, taking advantage of Treasury workstations that have modular solutions around cash flow forecasting or analytical tools. That has been a big movement as well. The bottom section here is really the result of a treasurer's focus on those three themes. And these are more advanced treasury constructs that get adopted. And in the context of M&A, of course, I see most advanced global clients, if you look just basically from a Fortune 500 or a Fortune 1000 standpoint, they're leveraging at least one of these with respect to shared service centers, or as they move up that 5-stage continuum, they look, do I have the technology to start to implement a payments factory or receivables factory? Is a POBO structure, a payment on behalf of, or a receivable on behalf of structure, capable within my organization, given the underlying IT architecture and the direction and the vision that we're going? So if anyone would like to talk about those in more detail, certainly we can talk after the presentation or ask a question, but these are the major themes that I'm seeing market-leading, globally advanced treasurers focusing on as they prepare to optimize their treasury organization and get ready for M&A. So let me move on to the next one. Okay, this is the last slide that I'm going to talk to, and then Amanda's going to talk specifically around the organization of Suncor and PetroCanada. Obviously, there's a clear bifurcation of focus when you think about M&A, and that is what needs to be ready on day one, what needs to be ready for near term within a matter of weeks or a month after the fact, and then there's the longer term imperatives from a treasury strategy standpoint that should fall into focus. So let's just walk down these, and these are ideas again that if you're a practitioner, this slide will help you just to trigger to think about what your organization is thinking about. First of all is structural alignment, and by that I mean that is your close day or near-term structure a reflection of what your longer-term vision is? You know, if you're looking to move towards an ISO XML file format longer term, you may want to think about day one, the implementation of that. If you're thinking about, you know, some advancement in forecasting, you want to make sure that your language and strategies around that on day one reflect at least a step towards that longer-term progression. Operating cash flows and forecasting, obviously cash flows is critical for close day, whether that's a cash acquisition that you need to make sure the settlement currencies are moving around as needed. If it's an equity acquisition, for example, you want to make sure you've got your banks and your agents working in concert as well. Forecasting, there has to be clarity around the expectations around your new affiliates and both the frequency and the tools that will be used to actually conduct your forecasting strategy. Organizational due diligence. Organizational due diligence is basically an understanding in the new context, and I talked about new geographies, new currencies, and everything that come with that, new regulatory environments. If you're purchasing a client, for example, if you've never been into Latin America, or if you've never been into Asia Pac, and all of a sudden you have 20 countries you have to deal with, your understanding of the regulatory environment, if you've only been dealing with North America, is 180 degrees different than what you have to get used to. And so the organizational due diligence from a tax standpoint, a regulatory standpoint, a legal standpoint has to evolve with your acquisition. So that's something that you need to think about. Understanding your needs is takes a lot of time, and I've seen one of the recent clients that I was working with as they go through their acquisitions, and they were a serial acquirer. You know, at the time they were dealing with 150 banks. They were dealing with over 500 accounts. They're trying to rationalize accounts. They're trying to justify and rationalize their liquidity management structure, trying to rationalize the banks that they had down to a core set of groups. But they didn't, frankly, they didn't know 20% of their banks, which means they didn't understand the pricing. They didn't understand the service levels. They didn't understand the counterparty exposures. And that's a big risk. So understanding the new needs, the new payment strategies, the new collection strategies, the new underlying IT environment is very important to understand from day one to make sure you have your arms around it, and then you can build that strategy moving forward longer term. Transition services agreement, and again, I'm not sure if you used one during the time, but traditionally this is an agreement used that facilitates from day one, if there is in fact not enough time, if the time period by the time you find out, and there's only weeks to a month to get it done, to actually close the transaction, you may not have enough to get your arms around and have everything in place. And so a transition services agreement allows for the target company to continue to provide services to allow day-to-day operations to flow smoothly until you can get your arms around and have the operations running smoothly. Governance, obviously, you want to make sure from day one you have a clear understanding of signatories, authorized limits, policies that the new target company needs to adhere to, whether there's risk management aspects that need to be taken into account. Governance is very important. And then the immediate IT structure, just getting your arms around what's the approach that clients are taking with communicating with their banks in the target company. Are they doing file import? Do they have a host-to-host connection? What is that host-to-host? Is it Swift-oriented? Is it bank-specific? What file layouts are they using? Is it in alignment or not in alignment with your longer-term strategies? So that's an important one to understand for short-term and close day as well. So as we move from what will be more tactical to what is more longer-term strategic imperatives, we look at the Treasury integration team. Of course, you know, there's the concept of an integration management office that PwC is a proponent of, and that's really just putting a cross-functional and a cross-geographic team together to make sure there's a clear understanding of the people, the systems, and the policies that are involved in the integration. It's usually driven by a finance leader. So making sure there's a clear delineation who's involved and who's included in that team is important from a longer-term standpoint because that could take time. If the acquisition takes place via debt, of course, there may be new covenants as a treasurer that you would like to have your arms around to understand. And of course, the management reporting will have to be there to track that. So that's important to be aware of. Depending on the deal thesis, I talked about a deal thesis and some of those critical aspects that need to be achieved in order to get to the synergy levels that are needed. Management will want to understand if you're progressing towards those levels. And so, of course, management reporting will need to be put in place, which means you have to have a comprehensive participation and understanding of the results of all the affiliates, new and old. So that's an important thing to remember as well. I talked about the bank account rationalization and even the bank rationalization as you look to who is now in my syndicate, what was their participation in the debt financing for this acquisition. Am I aware of these banks? You know, what is the counterparty risk with those new banks? What kind of wallet share now do I have to allocate to those new banks versus what I had before? Do I have to therefore RFP certain aspects of my business? And it could take, certainly RFPs traditionally take anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 months in order to get things up and running and fully evaluated. So that's a big process right there with respect to the bank rationalization. Liquidity management deserves, frankly, an hour discussion by itself. It's an evolving animal right now with Basel III as it relates to, are banks going to continue to offer multi-currency notional pooling or notional pooling at all, for example? I was speaking to a client yesterday, a large Fortune 500 company, and they've had to completely dismantle their multi-currency notional pool in the UK and now set up a physical pooling strategy and revisit the entire approach. So it's important to speak to your banker. It's important to understand what's changing from a regulatory environment. Policy revisions, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. How it does the acquisition shift your policy approach with respect to the currencies, the geographies, the new affiliates that are involved. The advanced treasury models that we talked about, that would have been the 6 modules down at the bottom with the constructs that are shared service centers, regional treasury centers, et cetera, that are there. That you may have a center of excellence that you want to impart upon the acquisition on the target company. They may in fact be more advanced than you, and you may think about embedding that strategy into your existing operations. So that's something to think about as well. It takes some time and work with your banker on and your legal counsel. The AP and the AR rationalization, you obviously want to search for continuity. It's not abnormal to buy a company and they're 100% checks and you're 100% ACH, and there's a cultural gap there that needs to be bridged and thought process. You have to be thoughtful around what that looks like culturally. Supply chain rationalization is, of course, you want to look at your vendor base. You may have acquired a set of affiliates that have a completely different supply chain and a completely different consumer base than you. So it may shift everything that you do. There may be, in fact, a large overlap, in which case you can re-rationalize terms and pricing with your existing supply chain. So something to think about. The IT strategy is what we thought about. You know, are you going to migrate to fewer ERP environments, fewer instances of a workstation? The longer term channel service approach is very important to think about. Again, with your banker and external consultants. Outsourcing the non-core processes that you do, and of course training and succession planning. You will be getting new people in the Treasury team. Are they properly trained? Do they have the experience to adapt to potentially what will be a completely new Treasury construct? Do they understand in-house banking? Do they even know what that term means? Do they understand how to optimize a shared service center? They may be much more advanced than you if it's that orientation. So there's a lot of training, thinking about what does their career look like moving forward in that new Treasury model, which is the softer side of things, not necessarily the quantifiable side. So I'm going to quickly pass it over to Amanda, who is...
So polling question number 2. So I think we'll probably just do show of hands again. Is your Treasury, how many of you here today feel that your Treasury, you're ready to integrate a transformational acquisition in the next 12 to 18 months? So maybe we'll just go A, who feels they're best in class? Oh. Anybody going through a transformation project right now? And so...
Yes, the hub.
So
That's right.
C, so not sure where to start, looking for guidance on how to optimize?
It's hard. I don't think there are a huge amount of practitioners here, but we'll keep moving forward.
So speaking on behalf of Suncor, given the amount of work that we've done over the past few years, I would have answered A for that. I feel quite confident in saying that Suncor's Treasury infrastructure is best in class now. I feel quite certain that any future mergers or acquisitions will be handled by Treasury as seamlessly as our recent acquisition of Canadian Oil Sands. Having said that, though, even with all the work that we have done over the past several years, we are still evolving. We haven't reached our final destination yet. The largest driver for Suncor, for our Treasury team, to get to where we are today was the actual PetroCanada merger. For Suncor, this merger was the catalyst to achieving greater efficiency. This merger was so big that it permitted Treasury to get the appropriate funding, support, the internal, external resources that we needed in order to complete those projects that were required to fully integrate both organizations. In our current operating, however, current operating environment that we're facing today, that kind of support and funding that we did have in 2009 to support all the integration activity, we definitely wouldn't have that. That would be a tough sell for Treasury. In keeping in line with the M&A themes that Cal just spoke to, I've prepared a slide, which is up already, that outlines the key integration priorities that Suncor's Treasury team focused on. And I've broken the slide down into 3 sections. So there's the Suncor pre-merger state, so what we started with before the merger, post-merger closing date, so what our structure looked like at the close of the merger, and then current state, so where we are today. The timeline for Treasury to move from that post-merger state to the current state was about 5 years. And one thing that I would like to mention here, and I'm strictly speaking from my own personal experience, was that before jumping into any integration work, keep in mind that it takes time for major change to take effect, and patience is critical. Major integration work does not happen overnight. It's definitely a journey. It was a journey for us, and in some aspects, we're actually still on that journey. And I'd also like to stress how important it is to ensure that you thoroughly plan all of your integration activities and ensure that you're engaging the right people, whether it's your tax team, your controllers, your banking partners, your IT, perhaps you require external consultants. Make sure that you engage these people early on, as their input and feedback should be considered before making any changes to your current infrastructure or processes, especially if there's impacts to any of the internal, the other teams internal within your organization. It's important that you get their feedback, get their input. You want to partner with them before you go ahead and make any changes. So we actually learned, there was a few hard lessons that we learned on the people engagement side from the PetroCanada merger. We actually applied those lessons learned during the COS integration activities, and it made a huge difference for the better. The post-merger priorities for Suncor can really be, I'm just going to categorize them into three main areas: banking and relationships, technology, and automation. So I'm going to highlight, as I go through each section of the slide, through each, the pre-merger, the close date, and the current state, I'm going to highlight each of these three areas, which should give you a better understanding of what Treasury's evolution was during the pre-merger to where we are today. So prior to the merger, Suncor had a pretty simple banking structure. We had one cash management bank in Canada for Canadian operations, and we had a U.S. cash management bank in the U.S. for U.S. operations. Between the two banks, we only had about 75 bank accounts. We had two pooling structures in Canada, one Canadian and one U.S. And in the U.S., given that we had a pretty small global footprint, our U.S. business was quite small, we didn't actually have a pooling structure in place. We only had a handful of bank accounts, and one of the legal entities was predominantly the most active legal entity, had about 90% of the activity. So we were actually able to manage our cash position with no zero balancing structure. On the technology side, we had one ERP system and one treasury management system. Pre-merger, our treasury management system, we actually were only using our treasury management system for cash positioning and cash forecasting purposes. We actually hadn't implemented all of the modules of the treasury management system yet. The reason being for that was that at the time, all of our treasury trading and settlement activity was actually processed all through our ERP system. Therefore, we didn't require all the extra modules for a treasury management system. We also had standard file formats in place for all of our outgoing payment files, our incoming bank files, and our incoming payment acknowledgement files. And from an automation standpoint, Suncor is actually fairly good at automating and standardizing processes. We had actually gone through a huge transformational project that went live on January 1st of 2006. And what that project did was it consolidated all of our ERP systems over to one centralized ERP system. And it also centralized all of our supporting functions for Suncor to Suncor's corporate head office in Calgary. So we actually created a shared service center at that time. We were receiving BI files from both of our banking partners, which were automatically being uploaded into our ERP system and our treasury management system, which made our bank account reconciliation and forecast reconciliation processes fairly straightforward. We had straight-through processing in place between our ERP and in both of our banks. So treasury and accounts payable, we created the EDI files, and all the files were sent directly to the bank for processing from our ERP system. There was no further requirement for us to log into any of the banking platforms to manually send files. We also had the EDI acknowledgement reports coming back directly into our ERP system, which made it very easy for us to detect any failed payments. So again, we didn't have a lot of reliance on logging into our banking platforms to get any of this acknowledgement reporting or payment processing reporting. We were fairly high on the straight-through processing scale prior to merger, so we were about 80% straight-through processing. Excuse me. That 20% gap was primarily due to the fact that we were still, in 2008, 2009, we were still issuing a fair amount of checks. And we also had a slight configuration issue with our ERP system, whereby we couldn't send files outside of North America. So anything that was inside North America was able to go directly to the bank and to the counterparty. Anything that was being paid outside of North America using the SWIFT code, we actually had to pay it manually through the banking platform. So Treasury, we were responsible for doing our wires, and accounts payable was responsible for doing their own wires. So if we fast forward now to post-merger, to close date, this is where it gets a little messy. So with the merger of Suncor and PetroCanada, Suncor experienced a huge growth in its cash management banking relationships. We grew from 2 primary banking relationships to over 30 banking relationships, which expanded outside North America and into international regions. For us Suncor Treasury folks, this was entirely new for us because we didn't have any operating accounts outside of North America at the time. So international banking was pretty foreign to us.
Literally.
Yeah.
Literally.
The number of bank accounts we had grew from 75 to over 600 worldwide. And given that we didn't have much experience in the international banking space, though, it was actually turned out to be a great opportunity for some of us to actually expand our knowledge into the international banking and payments world. And while we knew at the time that this decentralized banking, these banking structures that we had inherited were likely not going to work for Suncor long term, for the first year, we actually didn't make any significant changes to any of our international banking relationships. Given that we were primarily a Canadian-based organization, we did spend our first 1 to 2 years, pretty much 2 years, focusing on rationalizing our Canadian and U.S. banking relationships. But we actually didn't look at rationalizing our international banking relationships till 2012. So it was 3 years later after the merger. We did make a few small changes to the international banking structure just to make it easier for us to manage our cash and our intercompany loans. But for the most part, we really spent that first 2 years really just trying to understand this new international business that we were now operating and the business that we were supporting. And it was quite important for us actually to get up to speed on this international treasury business because with the merger, we saw the close of PetroCanada's London office. So PetroCanada had a big office in London that supported all of their international operations, And in that London office, they had a treasury team, a team of 8 treasury people. And so when that office closed, those 8 treasury people actually left the organization. So we had a few months to do some transition and some training, but it was a pretty quick turnaround. It was 6 months, I think we had, maybe shorter than that. Felt like shorter than that for sure. So what we had done was we had centralized our treasury team in Calgary. So PetroCanada had a treasury team in Calgary, Suncor had a treasury team in Calgary, so we just combined those 2 teams. And then in order to ensure continued treasury services and support our business stakeholders, we actually had to immediately start learning the new banking platforms, begin developing those relationships with our new banking partners, both on the international side and the domestic side. And we were extremely busy. When we had to absorb all the work from the London office, where there was 8 treasury people there supporting that business, we didn't hire any new people to come in and help us. So we took our existing team and we just absorbed the work of those 8 folks. So the first 6 months were very difficult. They were exhausting. One of the things we did do to just ensure there was stability and smooth transition was there was a few of us that started doing a 5 a.m. shift. So in order to be in the office and have some overlap with our Libyan office, our Syrian office, Norway, Germany, these folks, we had to ensure we had some overlap in case there was issues, and there were many, many issues. So it was exhausting. They say, oh, you come in at 5, you go home at 2. Well, that everybody knows that does not happen. You come in at 5, you go home when the work's done, right? Whether that's 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. So it was a big adjustment for some of us because we weren't actually anticipating that. That wasn't actually part of the planning process. So, on the technology side, to put it pretty simple, our technology framework became very, very complicated after merger. We inherited 3 more ERP systems, all 3 of which were different. ERPs did not talk to each other. So most of you probably know that trying to work with 4 ERPs is definitely not an easy task, especially when you're trying to streamline and rationalize the work going on within the organization. What this actually meant for us was that until the ERPs were consolidated, the majority of the work being done in Treasury actually remained in its current state. Some of the legacy process carried on for 2 to 3 years in some areas. In addition to the ERPs that we inherited, we also inherited 2 more treasury management systems. So PetroCanada's Calgary treasury team had 1 treasury management system. Their London office had another treasury management system. They weren't the same system. They didn't talk to each other. Then Suncor, we had our own treasury management system. And so what we decided was we actually migrated all the cash management over to Suncor's existing or legacy treasury management system, which is still the system that we're using today. Yeah. On the automation side, we actually didn't inherit a lot of automation from the merger. The majority of PetroCanada's bank files were not automatically being transferred to the banks via secure FTP. There was also no BEI file automation, so even for the Treasury Management System, so BEI files were being manually uploaded. In some cases, depending on the bank and the ERP system, they were actually manually keying bank files, bank statements into their ERP system, which was not what we were used to. Most of the payment files that were being generated were flat file payment files that were just manually being uploaded to the banking platforms, but only for ACH. So ACH files were being created and uploaded, wire files were not. So what that meant for us was that we actually inherited a lot of manual wire processing. PetroCanada actually had a policy, oh my, 5 minutes. We actually had a policy, they had a policy in place whereby Treasury did all wire payments. So for the whole entire organization, we managed the wire payments. So with that closure of the London Treasury office, we were bogged down with wire payments. So after the merger, what we would like to be focused on was integration work, and we weren't. We were focused on processing wires. And I remember feeling at the time that we were taking a huge step backwards because Suncor had spent so much time and effort in automating processes, especially all of our bank communication, and yet here we were doing wires for 4 to 5 hours a day. So here we are today, current state. I'm going to go through it quickly because we got the yellow light here. So it turns out we were quite successful at rationalizing our cash management banks. Today we have three primary banks in each of our regions. One bank in Canada, we have a Canadian and US dollar cash pool. We have a US dollar cash pool now in the US, and we have multi-currency cash pool in London for managing our EMEA operations. We've reduced our number of operational bank accounts from 600 to 350. And on the technology side, we now have one ERP system and one treasury management system. We've also implemented Swift Alliance Lite 2, and we've adopted the ISO XML standard as the new Suncor standard for all bank file transmission. We've implemented a bank administration software to help assist us with all of our bank administration activities, and we've also implemented a bank fee analysis tool, which helps us with our analysis of all of our bank fees and ensures that we're actually paying the fees that we've actually negotiated.
Is that through an EDA 22?
It is.
Yeah.
It's all automated. It's so nice.
Yeah.
And so with our treasury management system, we've actually now implemented all of the modules within our treasury management system, which has helped us immensely, especially on the payment side. It's really helped us minimize the amount of time we've spent initiating and authorizing payments. We've also built an interface to automate all the accounting from our treasury management system. So all of our trading that we're doing just automatically is interfaced through to our ERP system. And I'm especially proud to sit here today and tell you that we're 95% straight through processing on our payment side. So we still have a few manual wires that we're working to take care of. And we will eventually, we'll get there. We will be 100% at some point. I think so.
That's world class. 90 to 95% is a world class benchmark for STP rates.
That's
You don't
good.
get much
That's
higher
right.
than that. That's good. Really
And
good.
on the check issuance side, we've really worked tremendously hard to try and not print checks. Unfortunately, we're still printing checks. But we did set a target for ourselves this year to come in under 18,000 checks. And I'm happy to say we're tracking right on target to achieve that goal.
Good.
Question, what's the barrier right now for those checks? Why is it, like, it looks to me like you had 20,000 at the beginning,
Yeah.
and you're 18,000 now, so there's an underlying behavior that actually hasn't changed. You've got this lump and that lump is gone, but you're still more or less the same where you were.
Legacy
But
PetroCanada business.
it's all a bit, that's the barrier.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're working on it.
Is that a cultural?
Yeah.
It's a cultural issue?
They have their process to pass paper around the organization, and they like copies of their checks and copies of their backup, and that's something that we had a meeting last week actually, and we just got a group on board. So we're probably going to be, just from getting that one group on board with converting to EFT, probably down another 3,000 checks this year. So
So the 20,000 Suncor checks are now gone, and these 18,000 are all PetroCanada?
well, there's still a few of the Suncor ones that are around, there's a lot of land stuff that we have to do, checks for land and Government of Alberta checks. So we've just recently got the banking information for Government Alberta. So we currently do probably, this year alone, we've done 400 checks for them so far. So we're doing a significant amount of checks for them, which we've now moved to EFT.
Yes, sir.
Checks to EFT, or
For us, it was primarily cultural. There's a few things. So we have a Suncor Energy Foundation, which supports a lot of charitable organizations. And in that case, they do like to present, and again, it's cultural. We've talked to them about cardboard with magnets. They like to physically present a check. And so they've actually implemented a system now, but it won't go live until January 1st of 2017 to actually get rid of those checks. So gradually we're getting there, but it's taken us a really, really long time.
That's still a lot. Can you talk to anything around the senior sponsorship that you may have seen with respect to that? 18,000 checks is still quite a few checks.
The problem with our journey to get to where we are now on the checks is that we haven't really had that senior sponsorship internally. And the way our accounts payable group actually sits under supply chain. And so a lot of the checks that we see today are actually in our R&M business, which is not supply chain. So when we work with our accounts payable group to get rid of checks, they focus on supply chain vendors. So a lot of our supply chain vendors are all EFT. Very few are receiving checks because accounts payable has done a really good job at working with their buyers and their supply chain folks. It's on the R&M side.
R&M being?
Refining and marketing.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a lot of the PetroCanada business that we inherited from the merger.
Okay.
Yeah. So all of the work to get the checks has been really us in Treasury, working, going out and finding these groups and these teams. We haven't had that senior sponsorship that actually has mandated no more checks.
Do you think that would be effective if you could galvanize the interest?
I've tried, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, Tom and I have tried. But, question?
All right, quick question. When you were going through this process, did you hire a consultant to give you advice, or did you rely on your bankers to help you through this process, develop your roadmap?
We had a bit of both. So we had external consultants. Shortly after merger, when we inherited this huge international business, because they were actually operating some in-house bank that wasn't a true in-house bank, and it was a mess. So we hired some external consultants, to come in and help us clean that up. So that was the little bit of work that we did on the international bank rationalization at the beginning. But then going forward, we just really partnered with our banks. It got to the point where we didn't have that budget anymore, right? It only
Bankers
came
are
around
free.
at the beginning. And
Bankers will grovel and cuss you up for free. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Can you speak to sort of the soft skills that you sort of acquired or implemented when you were trying to make these sort of changes in terms of getting people off checks? And I imagine getting, well, you still have some work to do. I imagine there's some resistance to the 55,000.
A huge amount of resistance. And I guess at first our approach was a little bit more bold, a little bit more like, you can't do this. And they're saying, the business would come back to us and say, well, who are you to tell me I can't do this? So we actually had to take a different approach, and it was more or less a partnership approach. Hey, look at the inefficiencies in actually doing this. And it was really helping them see the inefficiencies and explaining to them the costs and the potential for fraud. And there was huge potential for fraud, and implementing positive pay. Mostly bankers here, you know, positive pay match is not cheap. It's very expensive. Well, it is for us.
You should bank with TD.
And so really going to the business and say, would you like for us to pass these costs on to you? Well, no, they don't want to eat those costs. So it really became a matter of just helping them actually realize what this was doing to the organization and what the benefits were to the rest of the organization for moving off checks.
I get the sense that you're potentially experiencing the same friction with respect to moving away from paper over to electronic disbursements.
No, I mean, we have a few partners who are just a lot larger than us.
Okay.
There's a question over here.
Yes, sir.
I was curious just in terms of how you managed your team's time and focus on day-to-day versus this very substantial project migration, and just how much you were able to plan up front during the due diligence phases versus how much you didn't really know until after close, and just sort of how you balance time and focus through that.
So there's a few things there. We did have integration teams in place. So we had one individual within Treasury specifically, and her main focus was on the integration. So she went to all the different meetings, and then she would relay a lot of that information back to say, this is what's happening in the rest of the organization. And she was getting a seat at the table to all these meetings. So really getting Treasury in there to see how we could actually partner with the rest of the business to figure out how we could optimize and help them make their processes more efficiently as we move through the integration. One of the other things we did, and it was, again, with the closure of the international office and with this policy that PetroCanada had around the wires and Treasury doing all the wires, we took all the work on, we really figured it out and really got to understand where these wire requests were being initiated from, and moved as much over to SEPA or ACH or local payment that we could. And then what we did was we actually transitioned those wires out to those different regions. So Norway had an accounts payable team. Well, we said, Norway, would you like to do your own wires? Sure, we would love to do our own wires. We were never allowed to do that before. Here you go. So we did that with about 4 or 5 different offices, and then it really took a lot of the workload off my team, and then we were able to actually work on integration activities. I don't know if that really answered your question.
Partly, I was curious just about how much you knew before close versus how much you found out after.
Yeah, what came out in the woodwork, yeah.
What you would do differently if you had any choice about it the next.
Yeah, so on the PetroCanada side, I was actually on mat leave right when that merger happened, so I'm not 100% sure on what, I know that we didn't know a lot, and that we struggled through quite a bit of it post-merger. For the COS acquisition, I can say is that until it turned friendly, we knew nothing. We really knew nothing. Once the deal turned friendly and we actually were starting to engage with COS, we knew a lot, and we knew what questions to ask because we had gone through this already. So it was a totally different experience, the PetroCanada merger versus Canadian Oil Sands acquisition. And I think with each merger acquisition you go through, I think we'll get better at it.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we can get better than 8 days. Like, I think 8 days is pretty solid. And we're actually, the integration team that worked on the Canadian Oil Sands acquisition, we're actually up for an operational excellence award at Suncor, which is kind of a big deal at Suncor.
So it's found in your cap.
Yeah.
Now that you've streamlined the entire global treasury to a remarkable phase, that is an amazing transition. So what do you find your biggest challenges now are?
Well, now we still have some manual wires. So there is one bank, our Canadian bank, we haven't moved to the ISO XML format yet. So hopefully that's this year or next year. And what that will do is that will actually get us off those manual wires. So it's an ERP, it's a configuration issue, but we're choosing to deal with that when we migrate to XML and migrate that bank over to Swift. And so we'll tackle all that this year into next year. And then I don't think we'll have any issues.
What do you think the next...
Just where do we get cash? Where do we get cash?
Where do you get cash? Do you think that at this stage it makes sense for you to think about in-house banking, something more advanced as it relates to some of those constructs? Is that the next step for you, or is... So
that's on our 5-year Treasury plan, is to go on to the POBOs, like the pay on behalf of, receive on behalf of structure.
Mm-hmm.
So the next step for us is our Canadian bank onto ISO XML Swift platform. Once we do that, the next step is the pay on behalf of, receive on behalf of. So we still are evolving, we still have some work to do. We're not actually at our end state. And then I think as the environment keeps changing and, who knows, we could absorb more companies by then. Hopefully not, but.
Right.
2 questions.
Can you just speak really quickly on the reconciliation issues that you may be experiencing?
reconciliation issues. We do not. Not us. So, do you mean bank reconciliation? Yeah, so because we don't do our bank reconciliation, we actually, it's our controllers team that does all the bank reconciliation. So what we've done actually is they used to come back to us a lot and say, where's the backup for this? Where's the backup for this? We need backup for this. Anything we're doing, any payments that we're processing in Treasury, we actually have LiveLink, and we actually have folders set up. So we scan and index everything that we do into LiveLink, and so our accounting teams can actually just go into LiveLink, and we index it so that it's the amount, the currency, and the date, like the value date. So if they're looking for something, they can just figure out the amount, the date it went out of the bank, and then there's the backup for them. So we used to have some reconciliation issues, and it was more or less the backup. There's no journal entry booked somewhere. Okay, now here's the backup. So we did that about 2 years ago, and it works great. Our accountants love it.
Good. Is there another question you said?
I think he had a question, but I'm not sure if we're out of time.
We can take one last
It's
question.
been flashing for a while.
Sorry.
I was just curious whether there was anything you took from your targets in terms of the Treasury approach, or if it was simply we're doing this a simple way.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I guess a lot of the advice we did have came from a lot of our banking partners. So I don't know if it was necessarily the Suncor way, but it became the Suncor way. And a lot of the times the banks would say, well, this is best in class. This is where you should be, trying to get to. And our director of Treasury is really big in the technology space. He used to work for one of the treasury management software companies. And so he's always about the latest and greatest. Yeah, so hence why we're on SWIFT and why we're already on ISO XML.
Did you see continuity in the advice you're getting from the banks, or did you see a lot of disparity in the comments by them around where you should be, how you should treat it?
No, it's pretty consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty consistent across the board. Yeah. Some banks just can't do yet what we want.
Sure.
You
And I think that's the distinction.
Because right now we're actually implementing with one of our banks to automate our receivables. So we have a lot of receivables for our downstream business. And so we're going to be automating the receivables through having file come in. Won't be an XML file though, because the bank can't do XML yet. So it'll be an EDI file, but it'll have all the information for all of our lockbox, our checks, our ACH and wire information, and then we'll map it directly into our ERP system, and it'll automatically reconcile all outstanding receivables. Yeah. Which I think is pretty new.
It'll be new for the Canadian landscape. It's not for a lot of the global banks. Wouldn't be new, but
yeah,
that's a very good step anyway.
Yeah, automate. That's what we try to do.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think we'll just close it up from there. If there's any other questions, we'll probably stop the recording now and we'll just go from there.